Jack Mercer didn't stop for towns. He hadn't stopped for much of anything in 20 years, but he stopped for her. She was 8 years old, barefoot on cracked concrete, a bruise the color of a storm cloud running from her jaw to her temple. She didn't flinch when he climbed down from his truck, didn't run, didn't cry. She just looked at him with eyes that had already learned the hardest lesson a child should never know, that the adults around her weren't coming. "Who did this to you, sweetheart?" She answered without hesitation. "My daddy, sir." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Jack Mercer had driven 1,100 miles in 4 days, and he was tired down to the marrow. His boots were dusty. His back ached from the cab of a borrowed pickup that smelled like diesel and old fast food wrappers. He had 4 ranch hands trailing him in a second truck, all of them just as road-worn, all of them wanting nothing more than a cold drink, a clean meal, and a motel bed that didn't sink in the middle. Red Hollow, Texas wasn't on the route. It was a detour, a wrong turn off the Panhandle Highway that added 40 minutes to a trip that was already too long. The gas gauge had been riding low since Amarillo, and Red Hollow was the only name on the highway sign for another 60 miles. So Jack had taken the exit and told himself he'd be back on the road in 20 minutes. That was before he saw her. She was sitting beside the ice machine outside Denton's Gas and Feed, a squat building with peeling paint and a screen door that hung crooked on its hinges. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and weeds, and the afternoon heat came off it in waves that made everything shimmer at the edges. She sat cross-legged with her back against the ice machine, both hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for a church service to start. She wore a yellow dress with a torn hem and no shoes. Her hair was tangled, and she had a bruise on the left side of her face that Jack could see from 15 feet away. What stopped him wasn't the bruise. It was the stillness. He'd raised a daughter once, a long time ago, and a lifetime away from who he was now. He remembered how children moved restless and fidgeting, and always looking for something to grab or climb or chase. He remembered how they startled at sounds, how they watched strangers from behind their mother's legs. This girl watched him the way a much older person watches the world, steady, quiet, like she'd already been through the worst of it, and there was nothing left to surprise her. Jack handed his keys through the truck window to Bobby, his youngest hand, and said, "Go ahead and fill it up. I'll be a minute." He walked toward her slowly, the way you'd walk toward a deer you weren't trying to spook. She tracked him with those eyes the whole way. He stopped about 4 feet away and crouched down so they were closer to the same height. His knees ached doing it, but he didn't let it show. "Hey there," he said. "You waiting on somebody?" She shook her head once, slow. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir." "You all right?" She didn't answer that one, just looked at him. Jack studied the bruise. It was 2, maybe 3 days old, going from purple-black near the jaw to a sick greenish-yellow at the temple. There were older marks on her forearms, thin faded lines that might have been something and might have been nothing, except that Jack already knew what they were. He kept his voice even. "Who did this to you, sweetheart?" "My daddy, sir." 4 words. No trembling. No tears. She said it the way a person states the weather. Jack sat with that for a moment, the Texas heat pressing down on his shoulders, the smell of gasoline and hot pavement rising around them. Somewhere behind him he could hear Bobby talking to the man at the pump. "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Emily Carter." "How old are you, Emily?" 8. "Is your daddy here right now?" "No, sir. He went to sleep." Jack looked toward the street, then back at the girl. "Does he know you're out here?" She seemed to think about that carefully, like it was a question she wanted to answer correctly. "He doesn't always know things when he's sleeping," she said. Jack understood what that meant. He sat down on the curb beside her, which surprised her. He could see it in the slight shift of her eyes. A brief flicker of something she quickly put away. Most grown men didn't sit down beside her. Most grown men didn't stop at all. "My name's Jack Mercer," he said. "I'm just passing through. On my way back to New Mexico after a cattle run." She nodded like that made sense. "You hungry?" She hesitated just a half second too long. I'm okay. I'm gonna go inside and get something cold to drink, Jack said. You want anything pop juice? She looked at the door of the gas station, then back at him. Mr. Denton doesn't like it when I come in. Jack went very still. Why not? Emily picked at the hem of her dress. He says I bring trouble. Jack stood up slowly, his jaw set. You just stay right here. I'll be back in a minute. He pushed through the screen door. The inside of Denton's gas and feed smelled like motor oil and packaged beef jerky. A ceiling fan moved the warm air around without doing much good. A man in his 60s stood behind a counter layered with scratch tickets and cigarette cartons reading a newspaper. He didn't look up when Jack came in. Jack took a bottle of orange juice from the cooler and a cold Coke for himself and set them on the counter. That little girl outside, Jack said. Emily Carter. The man turned a page of his newspaper. She been sitting out there long? Jack asked. I don't keep track of her. The man reached over and punched numbers into an old register without looking up. She's got a bruise on her face the size of a fist, Jack said. B350. Jack put a 5 on the counter and left it there. Seems like something a person ought to notice. The man finally looked at him. He had small eyes set deep in a weathered face and a mouth that looked like it had practiced not saying things for a long time. You're not from here, he said. No. Then you don't understand how things work here. Enlighten me. The man looked at the $5 bill, then at Jack. Then he took the bill and counted out the change. Emily Carter's father is Ray Carter, he said slowly, like he was explaining something to someone who was slow to catch on. Ray Carter's brother is Walter Carter. You know who Walter Carter is? Never heard of him. The man shook his head like that was both completely expected and deeply unfortunate. Walter Carter owns the land the bank sits on. He owns the land the courthouse sits on. He's had 3 county sheriffs elected in the last 15 years. He slid the change across the counter. What happens in the Carter family stays in the Carter family. That's just how it is. And the little girl, Jack said, is a Carter. Jack picked up his change and his drinks and stood there for a moment. That bruise didn't come from a fall. No, the man said, and went back to his newspaper. It didn't. Outside, Emily was still sitting exactly where he'd left her. Jack handed her the orange juice, and she took it with both hands, and thanked him in a voice so polite and careful that it made something hurt behind his sternum. He sat back down beside her on the curb. You got anybody looking after you? He asked. Grandma, aunt. Somebody like that. My Grandma Martha lives on the other side of town, Emily said. On Birchwood Road. She know you're out here. Emily unscrewed the juice cap with great concentration. I don't think so. What about your mama? The girl went quiet for a moment. She died, she said. 2 years ago, car accident on the county road. She took a small sip of juice. Daddy wasn't the same after. Jack watched the side of her face, the undamaged side. She had her mother's cheekbones probably. Big eyes the color of creek water. A little gap between her front teeth. Was he ever the same? Jack asked, not accusing, just quiet. Emily considered it seriously. He used to carry me on his shoulders, she said. Before. He used to call me his sunflower. She looked at the juice bottle. He doesn't call me that anymore. Bobby appeared at Jack's elbow, slightly breathless. Truck's full, Mr. Mercer. Boys are ready when you are. Jack didn't move. Bobby looked at Emily, then at Jack, then at the bruise. He was 22 years old and had grown up on a ranch outside Tucumcari, and he had the good sense to keep his mouth shut and wait. Go tell them to find a motel, Jack said. Something close. Bobby blinked. Sir? A motel, Bobby. We're not leaving tonight. Bobby opened his mouth, closed it, and went. Emily watched this exchange. You don't have to stay, she said. People don't usually stay. I reckon that's been the problem, Jack said. He stayed on that curb with her for another hour. She told him about her teacher, Miss Aldridge, who had given her a book about horses once, and let her eat lunch in the classroom on the hard days. She told him about her best friend Patsy, who had moved away last spring and never written back. She told him about the mare her father used to keep before he sold the horses, a gray one named Sugar, who would eat apple slices out of your palm if you held your hand perfectly flat. She didn't talk about the bruise. She didn't talk about her father. She didn't have to. When the sun dropped lower and the heat broke just barely at the edges, Emily said she should probably go home before her daddy woke up. Jack said, "Let me walk you." She looked at him sideways. That might make it worse. And that those 5 careful, practiced words from an 8-year-old was the moment Jack Mercer stopped being a man passing through. "Emily," he said, "where does your Grandma Martha live?" "Birchwood Road, the blue house with the porch swing." "Can I take you there instead?" She went very still. "Daddy won't like it." "I'm not asking your daddy," Jack said. "I'm asking you." Something moved across her face, then something that had been locked down behind those careful eyes. Not hope exactly. More like the memory of hope, something she'd filed away a long time ago in a place she wasn't sure she could still reach. "Okay," she said quietly. He walked her to his truck. She climbed in without being helped, settling herself carefully against the seat, the orange juice bottle held in both hands. Martha Carter was 67 years old, and she opened her front door before Jack even knocked because she'd seen them coming up the porch steps from the window. She was a small woman, wire-thin, with white hair pulled back and eyes that went straight to Emily's face the second the door swung open. "Oh, sweet girl," she breathed. Emily walked into her arms like she was walking into a harbor. Martha held her tight with both hands, eyes squeezing shut, and Jack watched them and didn't say anything for a moment. Then Martha looked at him over the girl's head. "You brought her here?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're not from Red Hollow?" "No, ma'am." She studied him for a long beat. The kind of studying that women who have lived long and hard lives do, reading a person not by what they say, but by what they don't say, by how they hold themselves, by what their hands are doing. Jack stood still and let her look. "Come inside," she said. Her kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and something sweet baking, and she sat Emily down at the table and poured her a glass of milk and cut her a thick slice of peach cake before she turned back to Jack and really talked to him. "I've been trying to get that child here for 6 months." Martha said, her voice gone flat and tight. 6 months. I've called the sheriff's office. I've spoken to the school. I've gone to Ray myself and begged him." "What happened?" Jack asked. "Ray locks her in her room when she misbehaves. Walter makes calls. The sheriffs say it's not their concern." She set her coffee cup down hard on the counter. "Walter controls too much of this town, Mr. Mercer. Jack Mercer. Walter controls too much of this town, Mr. Mercer. He doesn't care a lick about that child. He cares about what it would look like if a Carter child ended up in state custody. What it would do to the family name." Her jaw was tight. "So he buries it, every single time." Jack looked at Emily, who was eating peach cake, with the focused attention of someone who hadn't had enough to eat in a while. "Who else knows?" Jack said. Martha made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The nurse at the school, the doctor, half the women on this block." She lowered her voice. "They all know, Mr. Mercer. That's what I'm telling you. The whole town knows. They've just decided knowing isn't the same as doing something." "Why?" She looked at him like it was a foolish question, then softened because she could see he was asking honestly. "Because Walter Carter makes people afraid of what they'll lose," she said. "Jobs, loans, favor. And people will swallow an awful lot to protect what they have." Jack pulled out a chair and sat down at Martha's kitchen table without being invited, because his legs were tired and his mind was working hard, and he needed to think. Emily looked up from her cake. "Mr. Mercer." "Yeah. Are you going to leave tomorrow?" He looked at her 8-year-old bruised jaw, peach cake on her fork, waiting for him to confirm what everyone else had always done. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. Then she went back to her cake, but she didn't ask him not to leave. And somehow that was the thing that got him. Not the bruise, not the abuser, not the corrupt uncle or the coward town or the packed courthouse that was surely coming. It was the fact that she'd already stopped asking. That night, Jack sat in the parking lot of the Red Hollow Motor Inn in his truck, with the window down, listening to the panhandle wind move through the mesquite. Bobby and the other three hands were in their rooms, and the road back to New Mexico sat waiting for him in the dark. He thought about his daughter Claire. She'd be 26 now. He hadn't spoken to her in 8 years, hadn't spoken to her mother in longer than that. He'd left when Claire was 12, not violently, but completely the way certain men disappeared from families, sliding out sideways and replacing themselves with phone calls that got shorter and visits that got further apart until one year there simply weren't any. He hadn't been a Ray Carter. He hadn't raised his hand or locked doors or caused bruises that showed. He'd just left, and he'd spent 20 years telling himself that was different, that it was better, that a man who knew he wasn't built for staying did a family a favor by going. Emily Carter. 8 years old, sitting beside an ice machine. Because nobody was coming, she hadn't done a single thing to deserve what the world had handed her. And the world had handed it to her anyway, wrapped up in grief and whiskey and family politics, and a whole town's quiet decision to look the other direction. Jack had looked the other direction his whole adult life. He wasn't sure he could do it one more time. He reached into the glove compartment and found the small photograph he kept there. Claire at 10, gap-toothed and laughing at something off-camera, squinting in summer sun. He'd carried it so long the edges were soft. He sat with it for a long time. Then he put it back, started the truck, and drove to an all-night diner on the edge of town. He needed coffee, and he needed to think. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a plan was beginning to form. Slow, and not quite certain yet, the way fires started in green wood, catching and dying and catching again, until finally, something held. The waitress behind the counter was maybe 40, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers and hair pinned up in a way that had given up somewhere around noon. She poured him coffee without asking and said, "You're new." "Passing through," Jack said. She refilled her own cup and leaned against the back counter. "Folks passing through don't usually come in here at 11 at night looking like they're trying to solve a problem. What do they usually look like?" "Hungry. You don't look hungry." "I'm not." She tilted her head. "You asking about the Carter girl?" Jack set his cup down. "Am I that obvious?" "Word gets around fast in Red Hollow," she said. "Tommy Denton called his wife called her sister. Man from out of state walks in, talks to Frank about Emily, then walks Emily to Martha's house." She shrugged. "I'm surprised it took you this long to come looking for more." "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Lorene." "How long you been in this town, Lorene?" "My whole life," she said. "Which is exactly long enough to know what you're thinking, and exactly long enough to know why it won't work." "Tell me." She sat down on a stool across the counter and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and told him. She told him about Walter Carter, how his family had built the bank in 1923 and never really let go of it. How half the businesses in Red Hollow owed money to Carter-held notes. How the judge and Walter had gone to school together. How the last deputy who'd tried to file a formal report about Emily had been transferred to a border post outside Del Rio within 6 weeks. She told him about Ray Carter, not with pity, but not without it either. "He was a decent man before Darlene died," she said. "I'm not saying that excuses anything. It doesn't. But there was a real person in there once, and whatever's left of him is drowning in grief and guilt and the bottle." "And the girl just lives with all that," Jack said. "The girl just lives with all that," Lorene confirmed. Jack turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Who's documented it, the injuries?" Lorene hesitated. Just a flash, but he caught it. "Who?" he asked again, quieter. "Sandra Aldridge keeps a notebook," Lorene said carefully. "Emily's teacher. Dates. Descriptions. She started it on her own about 4 months ago. She's scared half to death, but she's been writing it all down." She ever shown it to anyone? She tried to show it to the principal. He told her to put it away and not speak of it again. Lorene paused. Walter plays golf with the principal. Jack nodded slowly. The doctor. You said he falsified reports. I said he's afraid. She stood up and refilled his cup. There's a difference. Is there? She looked at him for a long moment. You sure you're just passing through? I'm starting to reconsider, Jack said. She studied him the same way Martha had, reading the parts of a man that don't announce themselves. Then she set the coffee pot down and said, There's a young deputy, Dale Whitmore, 24 years old, been on the force 8 months, and the only one in this county who's ever actually written up a complaint against Ray and filed it properly. She paused. It was overturned by 9 o'clock the next morning. Walter saw to that, but Dale filed it. Where do I find Dale Whitmore? Jack asked. He'll be at the Casey's corner store at 6 in the morning, Lorene said. Gets a coffee and an egg sandwich every single day before his shift. Has done since he started. Jack left a 10 on the counter for a $2 coffee, and Lorene looked at it and then at him. You can't buy this town's conscience, Mr. Whoever you are, she said, not unkindly. I know it, Jack said, but I can try to wake it up. He walked back out into the Panhandle night, the wind still moving through the mesquite, the road to New Mexico still sitting dark in the distance. He didn't take it. He drove back to the motel, knocked on Bobby's door until the kid answered it half asleep and confused and told him they were staying at least 3 more days. Bobby stared at him. The ranch. I'll call Hector in the morning. He can manage without us another week. Jack looked at him steadily. You're free to head back if you want. All of you are. I won't hold it against any man. Bobby ran a hand through his hair. He was 22 years old, and he'd ridden with Jack Mercer for 3 years, and he knew the tone in that voice, quiet, decided, final, as a fence post set in dry concrete. What are we doing? Bobby asked. Staying, Jack said. Bobby nodded once slowly. All right then, he said. I'll tell the boys. Jack went back to his room, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and thought about an 8-year-old girl with creekwater eyes and a bruise like a storm cloud who had answered his question without flinching, and then drunk her orange juice in careful, polite sips, and asked him with no hope in her voice at all whether he was going to leave tomorrow. He thought about a daughter named Claire, who was 26 years old and living somewhere in this country, and had a father who had chosen the road over staying every single time it mattered. Jack Mercer wasn't a man who cried. He hadn't cried in longer than he could remember. Not at rodeos, not at funerals, not at the end of his marriage, not when his mother passed in a Tucumcari hospital on a Tuesday, while he was 3 states away. He sat in the dark room of the Red Hollow Motor Inn, and he didn't cry now either. But something broke quiet and clean somewhere deep in his chest, the way old wood finally gives not with a crash, but with a slow, certain crack, the sound of something that had been holding too long, finally letting go. He was staying, and in the morning he was going to find a young deputy named Dale Whitmore, and a frightened schoolteacher with a notebook full of dates, and a doctor who had told himself he was afraid. When the truth was, he was ashamed, and he was going to start the slow grinding work of building something that a well-dressed man with a courthouse full of favors and a family name like a loaded gun had spent years making sure could never be built. He didn't know if it would work. He wasn't sure he was the right man for it. But Emily Carter had sat beside an ice machine on a cracked parking lot in the Texas Panhandle heat and looked at the world with the eyes of a child who had stopped expecting anyone to come. And Jack Mercer had come. That was where it started. Dale Whitmore was exactly where Lorene said he'd be. 6 in the morning, Casey's corner store standing at the counter with a paper cup of coffee and an egg sandwich wrapped in foil, still in uniform, his shift not starting for another 40 minutes. He was younger than Jack had pictured, a lean kid with a jaw that hadn't quite finished deciding what shape it wanted to be. Dark circles under his eyes that said he hadn't slept well in a while. He looked up when Jack walked in, clocked him immediately as a stranger. His hand didn't move toward his holster, but his posture shifted just slightly, the way trained men shift when they're paying attention. Jack bought himself a coffee and walked over and set it on the counter and said without preamble, "You're the deputy who filed the complaint against Ray Carter." Dale went very still. "Emily Carter," Jack said. "The little girl." Dale looked at the man behind the counter, a teenager half asleep on a stool who wasn't paying any attention to either of them. Then he looked back at Jack. "Who are you?" "Nobody important. Name's Jack Mercer. I'm from New Mexico. I'm the man who walked Emily to her grandmother's house yesterday afternoon." Something moved across Dale's face. Not relief. Not quite. More like a door cracking open in a wall he'd built very carefully around himself. "How is she?" he asked quietly. "Bruised. Hungry. 8 years old and already knows better than to expect help." Jack wrapped both hands around his cup. "You filed that complaint in February. It was dismissed." "I know. Why'd you file it?" Dale was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw her," he said finally. "Came out on a domestic disturbance call to the Carter place back in January. Ray was drunk, neighbors had called it in. Emily was in the corner of the kitchen and she had—" He stopped, set his sandwich down. "She had a burn mark on her left arm, fresh, the size of a cigarette end." He said it flat and clinical, the way people describe things they've had to distance themselves from to keep functioning. "Ray said she'd fallen against the stove. Emily said the same thing. Didn't blink when she said it. She's been trained to say it," Jack said. "I know that." Dale's jaw tightened. "I filed the complaint the same day, wrote it up complete with photographs from my phone, submitted it by 4 in the afternoon. He picked up his coffee. By 9 the next morning, my sergeant called me in and told me the complaint had been reviewed and found insufficient. He couldn't look me in the eye when he said it." "Walter Carter made a call," Jack said. "Walter Carter made a call." Dale agreed. Flat. Tired. Jack looked at him. "You ever think about making another one?" The deputy set his cup down slowly. "Every single week," he said. "And every single week I think about what happened to Harlan Greer." "Who's Harlan Greer?" "Deputy who was here before me. Good man. 3 years on the force. He tried to push a child welfare referral through the county system 2 years ago. Different family, different situation, but same county politics. Within a month, he was transferred to a border post that nobody wants. His wife had to quit her job. They lost the house they'd been renting because they couldn't make the payments on one income." Dale shook his head. "I'm not Harlan Greer. I've got a sick mother in Lubbock and a car payment, and about $200 in my savings account." He paused. "But I'm not sleeping either." "What if there was more than just your complaint?" Jack said. "What if there were others?" Dale looked at him carefully. "What others?" "I'm working on that," Jack said. The deputy was quiet for a long moment. The teenager behind the counter dropped something and picked it up and went back to staring at nothing. Outside, the early morning panhandle was turning from gray to gold. "If you get others," Dale said slowly, "if you get enough documentation together that it can't be killed by one phone call." He stopped. Started again. "Then yeah. I'll file again. I'll file everything I've got. But it has to be airtight, Mr. Mercer. Because the first crack is where Walter Carter gets his fingers in." Jack nodded. "Then we make it airtight." He left Casey's with his coffee and drove to the elementary school before the first bell rang. Sandra Aldridge was already in her classroom when Jack knocked on the open door. A woman in her mid-30s, with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, and a cardigan that had seen better days, arranging papers with the focused efficiency of someone who ran on coffee and controlled anxiety. She looked up, and her expression shifted immediately to wariness when she saw a stranger. "Can I help you?" "Miss Aldridge," Jack said. "My name is Jack Mercer. I'm here about Emily Carter." Her hand stopped moving on the papers. "I understand you've been keeping a record," he said. She looked past him into the hallway, quick-practiced, then back at him. "Close the door," she said quietly. He did. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and brought out a composition notebook, the kind kids used for schoolwork. nothing on the cover to indicate what it was. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment before she set it on the desk between them. 14 months, she said. Every incident I observed or that Emily reported. Dates, times, descriptions. I photographed what I could when I had cause to. She looked at him. Last September she came in with a split lip. I asked her what happened. She told me she walked into a cabinet door in the dark. Sandra's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She walked into it. In the dark. That was her explanation. She was 7 years old and she already knew exactly what to say. Jack looked at the notebook. You showed this to your principal. He told me to destroy it. She met his eyes. I didn't. Has it ever left that drawer? No. It's going to have to, Jack said. She pulled the notebook back toward herself. If I use this, if I go official with any of this, Walter Carter will. I know what Walter Carter will do, Jack said. But right now Emily Carter is living in a house with a man who burns her with cigarettes, and the whole town is pretending it's a family matter. And that notebook is sitting in a drawer where it's not helping anybody. Sandra pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't going to cry, but it was close. I have a lease, she said. I have a job here. I have students who need me. I know. I could lose all of it. I know that too, Jack said. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to be ready. He stood. Because I think this is moving faster than any of us planned. And when it moves, I need to know whose names I have. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, You're not from here. You don't have a lease or a job or anything Walter Carter can touch. No, ma'am. Why are you doing this? Jack thought about Emily on the curb with her juice bottle. He thought about Claire at 10 years old squinting in summer sun. Because somebody has to, he said. And it might as well be a man who's got nothing left to lose. He was back at Martha's house by 8 in the morning. Martha met him at the door before he knocked again, and he was starting to think that was simply how she operated, always watching, always 2 steps ahead. Emily was at the kitchen table, with a bowl of oatmeal and a book propped open beside it, and when she heard Jack's voice in the hallway, she looked up fast and then looked back down at her book, and the speed of both movements told him everything he needed to know about how much she'd already decided not to want him to stay. Martha poured him coffee, and they stood in the kitchen doorway where they could see Emily but talk low. Ray's been to the house once already this morning, Martha said. 6:30. He didn't come to the door, just sat in his truck at the end of the drive for about 10 minutes and then left. He knows she's here. He always knows she's here. This is where she comes. Martha's voice was tight and careful. He comes and looks and then goes back. It's Walter who worries me more. Has Walter been by? Not yet, but Ray wouldn't have left without talking to him first. That's how it works. Ray does something, Walter manages the fallout. Like always. She looked into her coffee cup. Walter's managing something right now. I can feel it. Jack kept his voice low. Martha, I need to know who else will stand. I've got the deputy. I've got the teacher. Who else? Martha was quiet for a moment. Dr. Ellison, she said slowly. He's the one who filed false reports. But I don't think he's proud of it. I've seen the way he looks when Emily's name comes up. Like a man who knows exactly what he's done. You think he'd recant? I think he might if he understood that staying quiet wasn't going to protect him anymore. She looked at Jack. He's not a coward exactly. He's a man who made a wrong decision under pressure and has been living with it ever since. There's a difference. And who else? Martha thought. Patty Simmons. She lives 2 houses down from Ray. She's heard things, seen things. She's never spoken officially, but she's also never denied it to me. She paused. And there are women in the ladies' auxiliary, 4 or 5 of them, who have all had their own private conversations about Emily over the years. They know. They've always known. Would they say so in a courtroom? Martha looked at him. Her eyes were tired and certain. At the same time, the way eyes look when a person has been waiting a very long time for someone to ask the right question. If they believed it would actually work, she said, then yes, I think they might. Emily looked up from her book. Mr. Mercer. Yeah. Are you going to talk to people about me all day? There was no accusation in it, just a flat, practical question that made Jack's chest ache. Probably most of it, he admitted. She seemed to accept that. Grandma said I can stay here today. I don't have to go back. That's right. What happens tomorrow? He looked at her. 8 years old, sitting with oatmeal and a horse book, asking about tomorrow like it was a geography question, just a thing she needed the coordinates to. Not scared, not hopeful, just asking. I don't know exactly, he said, but we're going to figure it out. Okay, she said, and went back to her book. That afternoon, Jack found Dr. Ellison in his clinic, a 2-room office on the main street with a waiting area that smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. The doctor was a man in his 50s, well-dressed for Red Hollow, with silver at his temples, and the kind of hands that were always slightly too still, like they were compensating for something. He recognized Emily's name before Jack finished the sentence. I can't discuss a patient's records, he said immediately. I'm not asking about records, Jack said. I'm asking about the reports you filed that didn't match what you saw. Ellison stood up from behind his desk. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Dr. Ellison. Jack didn't raise his voice. That little girl has a burn scar on her left arm from a cigarette. You've seen it. You wrote something different. The doctor said nothing, but he didn't move toward the door either. I'm not here to threaten you, Jack said. I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm here because an 8-year-old child is running out of time, and I need a doctor who's willing to tell the truth. He paused. Whatever the reason you made the choice you made, Dr. Ellison, I'm not judging it. But I need to know if you can make a different one now. Ellison turned toward the window. His shoulders were up near his ears. Walter Carter came to me personally, he said, barely above a mutter. Came to this office, sat in that chair. He gestured at the chair across from his desk. He didn't threaten me with anything specific. He didn't have to. He talked about my practice, about how a small-town doctor depends on community goodwill, about how cases can be complicated. He stopped. And I altered the report because I was afraid of a man in a good suit, and I've hated myself for it every day since. Then help fix it, Jack said. The doctor turned back around. His face was not a young man's face. It had the lines of someone who had been quietly carrying something heavy for a long time. If I do this, he'll come after my license. He'll try, Jack said. That's different. Ellison looked at him for a long moment. Are you a lawyer, Mr. Mercer? No, sir. I'm a retired rodeo cowboy from New Mexico who made a wrong turn at Amarillo. Something shifted in the doctor's face. Not quite a smile. More like the first breath a man takes after he's been holding it too long. And you think that's enough? He said. Against Walter Carter. I think it's what we've got, Jack said. Ellison sat back down. He opened a drawer and stared into it for a moment, then closed it again. Give me a day, he said. I need to think about what I can reconstruct, what I still have. He looked up. I kept my own private notes, different from what I filed. I kept them because I knew even then. He stopped. I know, Jack said. He left the doctor's office and sat in his truck and called Bobby on the motel room phone and told him to take the other hands out to a proper dinner, his treat. Then he sat and watched Red Hollow move around him in the late afternoon. People going in and out of the hardware store, a woman hanging laundry on a line across the street, a group of kids running past on bikes. A town. Just a town. The kind that existed in 1,000 places across this country. Ordinary, forgettable, full of ordinary, forgettable people who had made one collective decision to let a child suffer because the alternative was inconvenient. His truck radio crackled with a country station out of Amarillo, something low and twanging that he didn't recognize, and he was sitting there thinking about Martha's list of names, the deputy, the teacher, the doctor, the women at the ladies' auxiliary, when his door handle rattled and he looked up. Walter Carter was standing outside his truck. Jack had never seen the man before, but he knew him instantly and completely, the way you can sometimes know a thing before you're told, because every detail lines up exactly with what you expected. Walter Carter was 60, or close to it, broad through the shoulders, a face that had started handsome and settled into authority. He wore pressed trousers and a button-down shirt, and he had the easy stillness of a man who never had to prove anything, because the proving had already been done for him years ago, by money and by name. He didn't knock. He just stood at the window and waited until Jack rolled it down. "Mr. Mercer," Walter said, "I understand you're new to our town." "Just passing through." Walter nodded pleasantly. "That's what I heard. And yet here you are, second day, still passing through." Jack didn't say anything. "You've spoken to my mother-in-law," Walter said. "To a schoolteacher. To a deputy. To our town physician." He tilted his head slightly. "You've been busy for a man who's just passing through." "I'm a curious person," Jack said. "That's a fine quality," Walter said. "In the right circumstances." He let that sit a moment. "I don't know what people have told you about our situation here, Mr. Mercer. I expect it hasn't been flattering to my family. People love a simple story villain-victim hero riding in from out of town." He smiled, and it was a practiced smile, warm enough to almost fool you. "My brother is a broken man who lost his wife and turned to the bottle. My niece is a little girl in a complicated family situation. This is not a story with heroes and villains. This is a family dealing with grief in the best way they know how." "That bruise on her jaw," Jack said, "isn't grief." Walter's smile stayed where it was. "I've spoken to my brother about his behavior. There are steps being taken. Family steps." He put one hand on the window frame, easy and unhurried. "What I'm asking you respectfully, Mr. Mercer, is to let us handle what is ours to handle. You seem like a decent man. I imagine you've got a ranch to get back to, people counting on you, your own business that needs attending." He looked at Jack steadily. "There's no reason this needs to become something larger than it is." Jack looked at him. At the practiced calm. At the smile that meant nothing. At the hand on the window frame that wasn't quite touching him, but was planted there like a flag. "That little girl told me her daddy used to call her his sunflower," Jack said. "You know, when she told me that, while she was sitting alone beside an ice machine on cracked asphalt with a bruise on her face that a grown man put there." He paused. "She didn't cry when she told me. She didn't even look sad. She said it like it was just a fact, like it was just something that used to be true and wasn't anymore." Jack met his eyes. "That's not grief, Mr. Carter. That's what happens to a child when the people who are supposed to protect her spend enough time deciding she's not worth the trouble." Something shifted behind Walter Carter's eyes. Not much, just a fraction. The smile didn't move, but the warmth behind it drained out completely. "I'll ask you one more time," Walter said, "to consider going home." "I appreciate that," Jack said. "I'll consider it." Walter stepped back from the window. He smoothed the front of his shirt. "Red Hollow is a small place," he said pleasantly. "People tend to find it gets smaller the longer they stay." He walked away without looking back, the way men do when they've decided the conversation is over, regardless of what the other person thinks. Jack watched him go. Then he picked up the truck radio and found a station that wasn't playing anything, and sat in the static for a minute, just breathing. Walter Carter had come in person. That meant he wasn't worried, not yet. He was still in the stage where he thought this was manageable, a stranger who could be persuaded or intimidated or waited out. He didn't know about the notebook. He didn't know about Dale Whitmore's photographs. He didn't know that Dr. Ellison had kept his own private notes in a locked drawer for over a year. He didn't know yet how many people in this town were one act of courage away from speaking. Jack drove back to Martha's house as the streetlights came on over Red Hollow. Emily was on the porch swing with a blanket over her knees, even though it wasn't cold, watching the street. She watched Jack park and walk up the path, and when he got to the bottom of the porch steps, she said, "Walter came by here too." Jack stopped. "When?" "About an hour ago. He didn't come in. Just talked to Grandma at the door." She pulled the blanket tighter. Grandma didn't let him in. What did he say? I couldn't hear all of it, but Grandma's hands were shaking after. Emily looked at him. He's not going to let me stay here, is he? It wasn't quite a question. Jack came up onto the porch and sat in the chair across from the swing. The night was coming in warm and still, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something it hadn't decided whether to be afraid of. He's going to try to stop it, Jack said. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Emily looked out at the street. Daddy's better when Walter's around, she said quietly. Walter makes him drink less, makes him act right for a while. But then Walter leaves again and... She stopped, picked at the edge of the blanket. I used to think that if I was really good, if I was quiet enough and didn't make trouble, and did everything right, Daddy would stay better. She paused. I was good for a really long time. Jack looked at her, this small, careful, devastatingly practical child, and he felt something turn over in his chest like a stone rolling off a ledge. Emily, he said, it was never about you being good enough. I know that now, she said. And the fact that she said it so quietly, so simply, with no anger in it, was almost worse than if she'd said it with tears. I'm 8. I figured it out. She looked at him. Why couldn't he? Jack didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one that would do any good. Are you scared? He asked her instead. She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. But I was more scared before you came. She looked back at the street. Is that dumb? No, Jack said. That's not dumb at all. Martha appeared at the screen door. Supper's on, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that cost her something to make it. Emily got up from the swing, tucked the blanket over the back of it, and went inside. Jack stayed on the porch for another minute, looking out at the dark street where Walter Carter had stood an hour earlier. Somewhere in this town, the man was on a phone right now, calling lawyers, calling judges, calling in 20 years of favors built on fear and money and a family name used like a blunt instrument. Jack had a deputy with photographs and a sworn complaint, a teacher with 14 months of documented evidence, a doctor with private notes and a conscience that had been eating him alive, a grandmother who hadn't flinched at her own front door, and a handful of women who knew the truth and had never been given a reason good enough to say it out loud. It wasn't much. Against what Walter Carter could put together, it was barely anything. But the next morning, the school teacher called Jack's motel room at 7 a.m. Her voice was shaking. He came to my apartment last night, Sandra Aldridge said. Walter Carter. He stood at my door and told me that my contract renewal was being reviewed, that there had been concerns about my professional conduct. She took a breath. He didn't mention Emily. He didn't have to. Are you all right? Jack asked. I'm holding the notebook, she said. A beat of silence. I want to use it, she said. I want to walk into whatever room matters, and I want to read every single date out loud, and I want someone to actually hear it. Her voice cracked just once, and then steadied. He came to my apartment, Mr. Mercer. He came to my home. And I am done being afraid of a man who thinks that 8-year-old girls are a problem to be managed. Jack closed his eyes for just a second. All right, he said. Then we move. They moved fast, faster than Jack had expected, and faster than Walter Carter had planned for. Dale Whitmore filed the formal complaint by 9 that morning. Not just the January incident this time, but a complete package. His own photographs, his own written account, a sworn statement from Sandra Aldridge, attached with 14 months of documented dates and descriptions. A second sworn statement from Dr. Ellison, 3 pages typed, which began with the words, I am making this statement voluntarily and with full understanding of its implications to correct a medical report I filed under circumstances I am not proud of. Dale walked it through the county courthouse himself, past the secretary, who knew his name, past the clerk who knew Walter Carter's, and he filed it at the window and got his time-stamped copy and walked back out into the Panhandle morning with his hands steady and his heart going like a freight train. He called Jack from a payphone 2 blocks away. It's filed, he said. Any problems? Jack asked. Not yet. A beat. Give it an hour. It took 40 minutes. Walter Carter had a Dallas attorney named Bryce Harmon on retainer, a man who billed $400 an hour and had the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. By 10:15, Harmon was on the phone with the county judge. By 10:45, the judge had agreed to an emergency hearing for the following morning. By 11, Walter had filed his own counter motion not to dispute the complaint, but to reframe the entire situation. His motion argued that Emily Carter's grandmother, Martha, was mentally unstable, emotionally manipulative, and had been interfering in a grieving family's private recovery for months. It asked the court to place Emily in temporary state care, pending a full custody review, which Harmon's brief made very clear would take no fewer than 6 months. Martha read the motion at her kitchen table, and her face went the color of old paper. "Mentally unstable," she said. "He's trying to control the framing before we get into the room," Jack said. "If the hearing starts about you instead of about Emily, we lose before we say a word." "Can he do that?" "His lawyer thinks so." Jack looked at her. "Do you have your own attorney?" Martha looked at him steadily. "Mr. Mercer, I am a retired schoolteacher on a fixed income in a town where the bank is owned by the man who's suing me." Jack called Bobby that afternoon and told him he needed money, not borrowed, not from the ranch account from Jack's own savings. Bobby didn't ask why. He just said how much, and Jack told him, and Bobby said he'd drive to Amarillo and wire it from the first bank he found. By 4 o'clock, Jack had retained a family law attorney out of Lubbock named Gail Forrest, who drove the 2 hours to Red Hollow the same evening and sat at Martha's kitchen table with her briefcase and her reading glasses, and went through everything they had piece by piece without showing any emotion until she got to Dr. Ellison's statement, at which point she looked up over her glasses and said, "How did you get this?" "I asked him," Jack said. She looked at him for a moment. "And the teacher's notebook, 14 months. She kept it herself." Gail Forrest took her glasses off and set them on the table. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I have been doing family law in West Texas for 19 years. In 19 years, I have seen exactly 3 cases where the documentation was this complete." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I think so," Jack said. "What I'm telling you," she said, "is that if we can get this in front of the right judge, we have a real case." She put her glasses back on. "The question is whether this judge is the right judge." "He and Walter went to school together," Martha said from the doorway. Gail nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting that. "Then we need every person on that witness list in that room. Every single one. Because the documentation wins on paper, but a biased judge can find ways to discount paper. What he cannot discount," she tapped her pen on the table, "is 10 people standing up in his courtroom one after another and saying the same thing." "10 people," Jack said. "How many do you have?" Jack thought about it. Dale, Sandra, Dr. Ellison, Martha, Lorene from the diner, Patty Simmons, 2 doors from Ray's house. The 4 women from the ladies' auxiliary that Martha had mentioned, who had been called by Martha that afternoon and had gone very quiet on the phone before 3 of them said yes. 8, he said. Maybe 9. "Get 10, Gail said. That night, Jack drove to the Carter house. He'd thought about it since the afternoon and turned it over every way he could and kept arriving at the same place if Ray Carter walked into that courtroom tomorrow. Still drinking and still carrying Walter's water. They were going to lose Emily, regardless of what the document said. But if Ray Carter walked in as something else, as a man who knew what he'd done, the whole shape of the hearing changed. It was the longest shot in the entire plan. He knew that. He knocked anyway. Ray Carter answered the door in a t-shirt and jeans, with barefoot, red-eyed 3 days of stubble on his jaw, and the particular stillness of a man who had been drunk earlier, and was now something between drunk and sober that wasn't comfortable to be. He looked at Jack and said nothing. "My name's Jack Mercer," Jack said. "I've got your daughter." Ray's jaw tightened. "I know who you are." "Then you know I'm not here to fight you. Walter says you're here to take Emily away from her family." "Walter says a lot of things," Jack said. "Can I come in?" Ray stared at him. Then he stepped back from the door. The inside of Ray Carter's house was exactly what Jack expected, and nothing he wanted to see. The particular disorder of a man who had stopped maintaining things. Dishes, stacked laundry, piled a bottle of whiskey on the kitchen counter with about 2 inches left in it. There were photographs on the wall. A woman with Emily's eyes laughing at something. Darlene. Ray sat down at the kitchen table and didn't offer Jack anything because it didn't occur to him. Jack sat across from him. "Walter's going to fix this," Ray said. His voice had the careful flatness of someone assembling sentences from pieces. "He's got the lawyer. He's got the judge. He says by tomorrow afternoon Emily comes home and you're back in New Mexico where you belong." "Is that what you want?" Jack asked. Ray looked at the whiskey bottle. "She's my daughter." "I know she is. She's all I've got left." His voice dropped. "Darlene's gone, and Emily's, she's all I've got." Jack kept his voice level. "Ray, look at me." The man looked at him. "I talked to Emily for a long time," Jack said. "She told me her daddy used to call her his sunflower. She told me you used to carry her on your shoulders. She told me about a gray mare named Sugar and how you taught her to hold her hand flat for the apple slices." He paused. "That's the father she remembers. That's the one she talks about." Ray's face did something complicated. His jaw worked like he was trying to swallow something sharp. She also showed up beside a gas station ice machine barefoot with a bruise on her jaw, Jack said. "And when I asked who did it, she answered without flinching because she's been trained to answer without flinching." "Don't," Ray said, low. "I'm not here to punish you," Jack said. "I'm here because tomorrow there's going to be a hearing, and Walter is going to use it to make everything that's happened to Emily about Martha and about me and about a stranger interfering in a family matter, and if he does that successfully, Emily goes somewhere you and Martha both have no say over." He let that land. "Walter doesn't care about Emily. You know that. He cares about the Carter name." Ray said nothing. "What happens to her if Walter wins this?" Jack said. 6 months in state care, maybe more, while lawyers argue, and then she gets handed back to this house because Walter's lawyer got the right paperwork through the right judge, and none of the people who hurt her or looked the other way ever had to say out loud what they did. He leaned forward slightly. "Is that what you want for your sunflower?" The word landed like a hand on an open wound. Ray put his face in both hands and sat there, and the kitchen was very quiet. Jack waited. Ray put his hands down. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying yet. "I don't know how to stop," he said, and it came out stripped and raw and honest in a way nothing else he'd said had been. "I wake up every day and Darlene isn't there, and I don't know what to do with that. I never figured out what to do with that." "I know," Jack said. "I told myself Emily was fine, that it wasn't like what it looked like." "You knew it wasn't fine," Jack said, not cruel, just straight. Ray's hands pressed flat on the table. "Yeah," he said, "I knew." The silence after that was the kind that had weight to it, not empty, but full of everything a man carries when he stops lying to himself for the first time in 2 years. Jack said, "Come to the hearing tomorrow." Ray looked up. "Not for Walter, not with Walter's lawyer beside you." Jack met his eyes. "Come and tell the truth, whatever it costs you, whatever Walter says afterward." He paused. "Emily's 8 years old, Ray. She figured out on her own that it was never her fault. The least her father can do is stand up and say the same thing in a room full of people." Ray looked at the photograph on the wall, Darlene laughing. "She's gonna hate me," he said. "Emily, she might," Jack said honestly. "For a while. But she'll know you told the truth when it mattered." He stood up. "That's something she can build on someday. You give her nothing to build on, and someday never comes." He left Ray Carter sitting at his kitchen table with 2 inches of whiskey he didn't reach for. The hearing the next morning started at 9. Walter Carter's attorney, Bryce Harmon, was already in the room when Jack and Gail Forrest arrived. Pressed suit, expensive briefcase. the kind of confidence that filled a room like weather. He glanced at Gale and then at Jack with the particular expression of a man who has assessed his competition and found it beneath concern. He turned back to his notes. The courtroom was small, a county hearing room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs along the walls that filled up faster than anyone had expected. Word had gotten around Red Hollow the way word always got around Red Hollow, and people had come not to participate, but to watch the way people watch a fire that's close enough to feel the heat. Dale Whitmore sat in the front row in civilian clothes. Sandra Aldridge sat beside him with the composition notebook on her lap and her hands folded over it. Dr. Ellison sat one row back, ramrod straight, looking at nothing. Martha sat at the table beside Gale Forrest. Emily wasn't in the room yet. Gale had arranged for her to wait in the clerk's office down the hall. The judge came in a heavy-set man, in his mid-60s, named Patton, who had the particular demeanor of someone who had made peace with the compromises he'd made and didn't intend to revisit them. He looked at Harmon, then at Gale, then at the room full of people, and his eyebrows went up slightly before he brought them back down. Harmon went first as expected. He laid out Walter's position in smooth, measured language: grieving father, complicated family dynamic, concerned uncle, trying to stabilize a difficult situation, outside interference from a stranger with no legal standing, elderly grandmother with documented emotional volatility. He had affidavits. 3 of them from people Jack didn't recognize, attesting to Martha's instability. He spoke for 20 minutes and he was very good at it. Then Gale Forrest stood up. She started with Dr. Ellison's statement, read it aloud, all 3 pages slowly. Every word, every date, every description of what he'd seen and what he'd written instead, and why. The room got very quiet during that reading, the particular quiet of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. Harmon objected twice. Judge Patton sustained the first one and overruled the second one, and the way he overruled it flat, without looking at Harmon, was the first indication that something in the room wasn't moving the way Walter had planned. Then Sandra Aldridge took the stand. She opened the composition notebook and she read from it. Date by date, incident by incident, 14 months of a child's suffering narrated in a schoolteacher's careful handwriting. A split lip, a burn scar. A child who ate lunch in the classroom every Monday, because weekends were the hardest days. A little girl who had learned to change her story mid-sentence when she remembered she wasn't supposed to say the true thing. When Sandra finished, the room was the kind of silent that had texture to it. Harmon stood and said, "Your Honor, this testimony represents nothing more than the speculation of a schoolteacher with no medical qualifications." "Sit down, Mr. Harmon." Judge Patton said it without raising his voice. Harmon sat. Patty Simmons took the stand next. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s who had lived 2 houses from Ray Carter for 9 years and who had spent the last 9 years telling herself it wasn't her business. She held the railing of the witness chair so hard her knuckles went white, and she said, "I heard that child scream in the middle of the night, more times than I can count, and I turned my TV up louder." Her voice broke on the last word. "I turned my TV up louder, and I am ashamed of that." Then the first woman from the ladies' auxiliary, then the second, then the gas station owner Frank Denton, who had not been on the witness list, who had not been asked, who walked in through the side door 20 minutes into the hearing and said to the bailiff that he'd like to add a statement if the judge would permit it. Judge Patton looked at him for a moment, then said, "Permitted." Denton stood at the front of the room without sitting in the witness chair, because the chair looked too formal for what he wanted to say, and he said, "I've lived in Red Hollow my whole life. I told a man 2 days ago that things work a certain way here. I'm standing here today because I don't want that to be true anymore." Walter Carter, sitting in the second row, said in a low, controlled voice to Harmon, "Stop this." Harmon leaned over and said equally low, "I can't." And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. Ray Carter walked in. He was sober. He had shaved. He was wearing a clean shirt that was buttoned wrong at the collar, and he either hadn't noticed or didn't care. He walked down the center aisle, and the room watched him in absolute silence, and Walter watched him with an expression that was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing Jack had seen on his face. Sharp, sudden alarm, like a man realizing mid-sentence that the ground under him has changed. Ray stopped at the front of the room. "I'd like to speak," he said to the judge. Judge Patton looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you are currently represented by Mr. Harmon." "I know that," Ray said. "I'm firing him." Harmon stood up. "Your Honor, my client is clearly under duress." "Oh, sit down," Ray said, and he said it with a quiet that stopped Harmon cold. The quiet of a man who has decided something and has nothing left to protect. He looked at the judge. "I hurt my little girl. I did it more than once, and I knew it was wrong every single time, and I told myself it was the grief that did it, and that's a lie I've been telling for 2 years. His voice was flat and terrible in its honesty. "Emily didn't do a single thing wrong. Not one. She was just the closest person to me, and I took everything I couldn't carry and I put it on her." He stopped, swallowed. "I need help. I know that now. I needed it a long time ago, and I was too ashamed to say it." He turned and looked directly at Walter. "And my brother has been covering for me because he cares more about the Carter name than about my daughter, and I let him do it, and that's on me too." Walter Carter's face had gone absolutely still. The room didn't make a sound. Ray turned back to the judge. "I'm asking you to give Emily to her grandmother, not temporarily, permanently, until I can prove to a court and to my daughter that I'm someone different." His hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "She deserves that. She deserves better than what I've been." He sat down in the nearest folding chair, which happened to be right next to Jack. Jack didn't say anything. After a moment, Ray said very quietly, without looking at him, "I couldn't not come." "I know," Jack said. And then the clerk's door at the side of the room opened, and Emily Carter walked in. Nobody had called for her. Gail had not signaled anyone. She had simply heard the voices from down the hall and opened the door herself, and walked into the room, and she stood at the edge of it in a clean dress Martha had bought her, looking at the judge, at her father, at the room full of people who had come to decide something about her life. Judge Patton looked at her. "Young lady," he said carefully, "you don't have to be in here." Emily looked at him with those creek-water eyes. "I know," she said. "I want to be." She walked to the front of the room, and she stood in front of the judge's bench, small and bruised and completely eerily calm, and she said 5 words. "I don't want to go back." Walter Carter stood up from his seat. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Carter." The judge didn't raise his voice. He kept his eyes on Emily. "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" Emily thought about it for a moment, the way she thought about everything, carefully, honestly. "I don't hate my daddy," she said. "I just can't live there anymore." The courtroom was so quiet that Jack could hear the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Walter sat back down. And for the first time in as long as anyone in Red Hollow could remember, Walter Carter had nothing left to say. Judge Patton looked at Bryce Harmon, then at Walter, then at the room full of people, the doctor, the teacher, the deputy, the neighbors, the women who had come because they were done being quiet. Then back at Emily. "This court," he said, "grants temporary emergency custody of Emily Carter to Mrs. Martha Carter, effective immediately pending a full review hearing to be scheduled within 30 days. He looked at Walter. "I'm also referring this matter to the State Bar for review of the evidentiary record in this case, including the circumstances under which a prior formal complaint was suppressed." He set down his pen. "We're adjourned." The crack of the gavel was the loudest sound in the room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sandra Aldridge let out a breath like she'd been holding it for 14 months, which was more or less accurate. Dale Whitmore stood up, and his chair scraped loud against the floor. Dr. Ellison put both hands flat on his knees and bowed his head forward, not in defeat, but in something that looked from the outside like relief. Emily turned around and found Jack. She walked straight to him across the front of the courtroom, past her father, who watched her come with an expression that was going to take years to fully understand, and she stopped in front of Jack and looked up at him and said nothing. Jack crouched down to her level, the same way he had on the first afternoon beside the ice machine, his knees aching the same as they always did. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded once. "That was brave," he said. She looked at him with those steady, ancient eyes. "You stayed," she said. "So I could be." Behind her, Walter Carter walked out of the courtroom alone. Harmon at his shoulder, talking fast and low, and the door closed behind them, and the room left behind began slowly to breathe again. Martha took Emily's hand. Ray Carter sat in his folding chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and the people around him gave him space because there was nothing left to say to a man at the beginning of the hardest reckoning of his life. Jack stood up. He knew Walter Carter wasn't finished. A man like that was never finished after one courtroom. He had lawyers and money and 20 years of favors to call in, and the temporary custody order was exactly that, temporary. The real fight, the one that would determine where Emily spent the next 10 years of her life, was still coming. And he knew something else, something that settled in his chest like a stone, finding its final resting place. He wasn't going to be able to walk away from it. Not this time. Jack knew it was coming. He just didn't know when. That was the thing about men like Walter Carter. They didn't quit after a courtroom loss, they regrouped. They made calls, they found angles. A man who had spent 40 years building influence in a county didn't dismantle overnight, and a temporary custody order granted by a judge who was already feeling the heat of the state bar referral was the kind of order that could be appealed, delayed, complicated, until a child ended up exactly where she started, while the paperwork sorted itself out over 6 careful months. Jack stayed at Martha's house that first night after the hearing. Not in the house, on the porch in the chair with the loose armrest with his jacket on against the cooling panhandle air. Bobby came by at 10 and didn't ask why Jack was sitting on an old woman's porch at that hour. He just pulled another chair over and sat down, and the two of them drank coffee and watched the street. "You think he's coming tonight?" Bobby asked. "I think he's thinking about it," Jack said. "What's the play if he does?" "We don't give him a reason to make it physical," Jack said. "We just make sure he knows the math has changed." Bobby nodded, turning his cup in his hands. "The other boys are parked on Birchwood Road, 2 at each end." He paused. "Dale Whitmore drove by twice in the last hour." Jack looked at him. "I called him," Bobby said without apology. "Figured an extra badge wasn't a bad idea." "Good thinking," Jack said. Inside the house, everything was quiet. Martha had gotten Emily bathed and into bed by 8, and Emily had gone without argument, which said more about how exhausted she was than about compliance. She'd fallen asleep with her horse book open on the pillow beside her, and Martha had gently taken it and set it on the nightstand and stood in the doorway of the small bedroom for a long moment before she came back to the kitchen. She poured herself tea and stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around the cup. "He's going to try something," she said, not a question. "Probably," Jack said from the doorway. "He's never not gotten what he wanted," Martha said. "Not in this county, not once in 40 years. She looked at her tea. "I've watched him do it. I watched him do it to my daughter when Darlene was alive, watched him do it to Ray, watched him do it to this entire town. And every time people just stepped aside, because it was easier." "People stepped up today," Jack said. "Today," Martha said. The word had a careful weight to it, not cynical exactly, but honest. "We'll see about tomorrow." She was right to be careful. Because tomorrow came in the shape of a phone call at 7 in the morning. Gail Forrest's voice, tight and controlled on the other end, telling Jack that Harmon had filed an emergency appeal with the state court in Austin overnight. Not on the custody ruling, on the process. On procedural grounds. On the argument that the hearing had been conducted improperly, that Martha's attorney had introduced evidence without proper advance notice, that the judge had exceeded his authority in making a same-day ruling on an emergency motion. "Can he win that?" Jack asked. "Not on the merits," Gail said. "But he doesn't need to win it. He just needs it to generate a stay. If the state court issues a temporary stay on the ruling, while they review the appeal, Emily goes back to Ray pending the outcome." How long does that take? Weeks. Maybe months. Jack was quiet for a moment. What do we do? I'm filing a response today, Gail said. I'm also calling 2 people I know at the state bar who are going to be very interested in Dr. Ellison's statement and the question of how a formal complaint got suppressed in February. She paused. This is going to get messier before it gets cleaner, Jack. I need you to know that. Emily's not going back to that house, Jack said. Then hold the line, Gail said. And don't do anything that gives Walter's lawyers a reason to paint you as the unstable element in this situation. He held that last sentence in his mind for the rest of the morning, because it was exactly the kind of thing Walter Carter was counting on. That pressure applied steadily enough would make somebody on their side do something rash. Something that shifted the story from a child who needed protection to a stranger cowboy who was out of control. Jack did not intend to give him that. The morning passed. Gail filed her response. Dale Whitmore drove by Martha's house 4 more times, enough that it stopped looking like patrol and started looking like a statement, which was exactly what Jack had suggested. Sandra Aldridge came by at noon with a casserole and sat with Martha for an hour, and the 2 women talked in low voices in the kitchen while Jack sat on the porch. Emily came outside at 2 and sat on the porch steps. She'd been quiet all morning, not withdrawn, just contained, moving carefully through the house like she was still deciding whether she was allowed to take up space in it. She'd helped Martha with dishes without being asked. She'd folded her own blanket with military precision. She'd eaten breakfast and said thank you and cleared her own plate. It was, Jack thought, the behavior of a child who had been trained to stay invisible. You don't have to be good all the time, he said. She looked back at him over her shoulder. You can just be here, he said. You don't have to earn it. She turned back to the street. A long pause. Then, what if I forget how? Jack set his coffee down. You don't forget how, he said. You just need some time to remember. She picked at a loose piece of porch railing. Is Walter going to take me away? He's going to try, Jack said. That's different from doing it. You keep saying that, Emily said. Trying is different. Because it is. She turned around fully to look at him. But what if the judge changes his mind? Grandma said there's an appeal. Jack held her gaze. Then we go back to court. And we bring more people. And we keep going. What if you run out of money? Then we figure something out. What if you have to leave? She asked, and her voice stayed level, but her eyes didn't. You have a ranch. You have people waiting on you. Emily, I'm just asking the real question, she said with that devastating practicality that hit Jack every time like a fist to the chest, this 8-year-old who had learned to ask the real question before she let herself believe anything. I'm not leaving until this is settled, Jack said. That's the honest answer. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the street and said, Okay, and went back to picking at the railing. That night, Laureen from the diner called Martha's house. She said Frank Denton had overheard something at his gas station that afternoon. 2 men filling up a truck nobody recognized, and they'd asked Frank how to get to Birchwood Road. Frank had told them he didn't know, even though every person in Red Hollow had known how to get to Birchwood Road since childhood. Jack hung up the phone and looked at Bobby. Tonight, Bobby said. Tonight. Jack agreed. He called Dale Whitmore. Then he went room to room in Martha's house and made sure the windows were locked, which was more about making Martha feel he had a plan than because he believed locks would stop what was coming. Then he sent Martha and Emily to the back bedroom, the one with no street-facing windows, and he told Martha to keep the lights off and not to come out regardless of what she heard. Martha looked at him. Jack? Yes, ma'am. Be careful, she said. Not pleading, just direct. The way she said everything. Always am, he said. Bobby and the other 3 hands, Pete Marcus, and a quiet man named Creed, who had the build of someone who'd done hard things and preferred not to talk about them, were on the porch and in the yard. Dale Whitmore's cruiser was parked at the end of the block, lights off. They didn't wait long. Two trucks, no plates that Jack could see in the dark, pulled up on Birchwood Road at 11:40. 4 men got out of the first, 3 from the second. They weren't carrying weapons, at least not visibly. This wasn't that kind of operation. This was the other kind. The kind that worked with numbers and intimidation, and the clear implication that if you were smart, you'd make this easy on yourself. Walter Carter got out of the passenger side of the second truck. He was still in his pressed clothes because Walter Carter apparently did not own another kind. He walked up toward the house and stopped when he saw Jack on the porch. Jack stood up from the chair. "Evening," he said. Walter looked at the men behind Jack, then at the men in the yard. He'd brought 7. Jack had 4 ranch hands, Dale Whitmore, coming up the walk from the street, and 2 neighbors from down Birchwood Road who had seen the truck stop and walked out of their own houses to stand in their front yards without being asked. They weren't armed. They weren't threatening anything. They just stood there in the dark watching. Walter looked at them. Something shifted in his face, small, barely visible, but Jack had been watching his face for 3 days, and he caught it. "This is private property," Jack said from the porch. "Martha Carter's private property." "I'm here to see my nephew's child," Walter said. "The court says she's in Martha's care right now." "There's an appeal pending." "There is," Jack said. "And until that appeal is decided, the court's order stands. You know that. Your lawyer knows that, which means you also know that what you're doing right now isn't legal." He paused. "You're violating a court order, Walter, at 11:40 at night, with 7 hired men." Walter looked at Dale Whitmore. "Deputy?" Dale put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I'm off duty," he said, "but I'm also a sworn officer, and I'm watching a man violate a standing court order." He paused. "Sir?" One of Walter's 7 men shifted his weight. Then a second one looked at the neighbors in their yards. Then the one nearest the truck turned and opened the truck door and leaned against it and said nothing, which was the posture of a man deciding how much he was actually being paid to be here. Walter saw it happen. All of it. He stood in the dark of Birchwood Road, and he watched his leverage dissolve 1 man at a time, and his face did a thing Jack had never seen it do before it went uncertain. Not afraid. Not yet. But uncertain which, in a man like Walter Carter, was the first crack in something that had never cracked before. "You cannot keep doing this," Walter said, and his voice had lost its boardroom smoothness. There was something underneath it now, bare and hot. "This is my family. This is my name." "It's a little girl's life," Jack said. "And she said she doesn't want to go back. She said it in front of a judge and 20 people, and she meant every word." "She's 8 years old enough to know what's been done to her," Jack said. "And you know that too. You've always known. You just decided your name was worth more than she was." Walter's jaw went tight. "You have no idea what this family—" "I know exactly what this family did," Jack said. "And so does every person standing on this street right now." The second hired man from the first truck had walked back to the vehicle entirely. He sat in the cab. The door closed. A third one looked at Walter and said almost apologetically, "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. This isn't— I was told this was a custody pickup, not a—" "It is a custody. There's a court order," the man said flat. "I'm not part of a court order violation." He got in the truck. Walter turned and looked at the men who were left. 2 of them. His own driver. And the night around him, the neighbors in their yards, Dale Whitmore with his hands in his pockets, Bobby and Pete and Marcus and Creed on the porch, Jack standing at the top of the steps, Red Hollow watching. Not afraid anymore. That was the thing. That was the thing that Jack saw happen in real time on Walter Carter's face the moment he understood that the fear was gone. Not because anyone had threatened him, not because anyone had overpowered him, but because enough people had simply decided one by one that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. And once that decision got made in a town, it didn't unmake itself. Walter Carter stood alone on Birchwood Road with his careful clothes and his practiced authority, and he had nothing. "I will bury you," he said to Jack, quiet, stripped of theater. "You're welcome to try," Jack said. Dale Whitmore stepped forward. "Walter Carter," he said, and his voice was steady in a way that Jack suspected it hadn't always been. "I'm placing you under arrest for violation of a standing court order. You have the right to remain silent." He kept going with the rest of it steady and clean, and Walter listened to it with the rigid stillness of a man who has never been on the receiving end of that sentence and cannot quite process that he is now. Walter's driver looked at the cruiser at the end of the block, looked at Dale, looked at Walter, and then quietly he stepped aside. The handcuffs were the loudest sound on Birchwood Road at midnight. Jack stayed on the porch until Dale's cruiser turned off the street. Then he went inside. Martha was already in the hallway. She'd heard enough to know it was over at least for tonight, and she was standing with her arms crossed over her chest, and her eyes too bright, doing the thing she always did, with strong feeling, which was to hold it very still inside herself until she could decide what to do with it. "He's gone," she asked. "He's in custody," Jack said. "Violation of the court order. It goes on the record with the state bar referral." Martha put one hand over her mouth, one breath. Then she lowered it and said, "Good." The door at the back of the hallway opened a crack. Emily stood in it, half lit by the nightlight in the bedroom in her nightgown, her hair pressed flat on one side from the pillow. She looked at Jack. "Is it finally over?" she asked. Jack thought about what Gail had said that morning, "Messier before it gets cleaner." He thought about the appeal in Austin, and the state bar review, and the 30-day full hearing still coming. He thought about Ray Carter, alone in his house on the other side of town, beginning what was going to be the longest and hardest walk of his life. He thought about the work that wasn't finished, couldn't be finished in a week or a month, or maybe in years. And he thought about what this child needed to hear at midnight on Birchwood Road, standing in a doorway in her nightgown, 8 years old, asking the only question that mattered to her. "For tonight," he said, "yes." She looked at him. "Just tonight." "Tonight's enough," he said. "You can sleep." She considered that for a moment, the way she considered everything. Then she nodded and went back inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. Martha looked at Jack. Something passed across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory, the look of a woman who had been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time and had just for the first time put part of it down. "You should sleep too," she said. "In a bit," Jack said. He went back to the porch. Bobby was still there, which didn't surprise him. Bobby poured the last of the thermos into Jack's cup and handed it over without a word. The street was quiet. The neighbors had gone back inside. The trucks were gone. Jack wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the dark street and thought about Gail's voice on the phone that morning saying, "Hold the line," and he thought about Dale Whitmore filing that first complaint back in February and watching it disappear by 9 the next morning and coming back to work the day after that, still wearing the badge, still getting his coffee at Casey's corner store, still writing things down. And he thought about Sandra Aldridge, keeping a composition notebook in the bottom drawer of her desk for 14 months, because she hadn't been given a reason good enough to use it, but she'd been given enough reason to keep writing. People held on in the strangest ways, in the quietest ways, in ways that didn't look like resistance until something came along to reveal them. "Bobby," Jack said. "Yeah." "When we get back to New Mexico." "Yep." "I need to find a phone number," Jack said, "for my daughter." Bobby was quiet for a moment. "Claire." "Yeah." Another moment. "Hector's got a cousin who does that kind of thing, finding people." Bobby turned his cup in his hands. "I can ask him." "Do that," Jack said. They sat on the porch until 2 in the morning, until the street was nothing but dark and quiet, and the panhandle wind moving through the neighbor's cottonwood tree. Then Jack went inside and stretched out on Martha's couch with his boots on and his jacket over him and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep right away. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him, the old boards, the refrigerator, hum from the kitchen, the cottonwood against the window, and he thought about the full custody hearing 30 days out, and Gail's response to the appeal, and whether Dr. Ellison would hold steady, when Harmon's people came back for him, which they would. But underneath all of it, steadier than any of the rest, Emily Carter asleep in the back bedroom in a house that locked from the inside with people who were staying. That was something. That was more than she'd had 3 days ago. Jack closed his eyes, and for the first time since Red Hollow slept without dreaming. What he didn't know yet, what nobody on Birchwood Road knew as the town went quiet around them, was that Walter Carter, sitting in a holding cell at the Red Hollow Sheriff's Office, had already placed a phone call to a judge in Austin who owed him a favor so old it had almost been forgotten. Almost. The appeal wasn't dead. Walter wasn't done. And the morning was going to bring something none of them had planned for. The call came at 6:15 in the morning. Gail Forrest's voice had a different quality to it than usual. Tighter, faster, the way a person sounds when they've been awake since 4 and have already run through every option twice. Walter made a call last night from the holding cell, she said. Judge Harold Fitch in Austin, 3rd Circuit. They went to law school together in 1962. Jack sat up on Martha's couch. What did he get? Not a stay, Gail said. Not yet. But Fitch is reviewing the appeal personally instead of sending it to his clerk, which means it's getting prioritized, which means we could have a ruling by end of week. She paused. If Fitch issues the stay, Emily goes back to Ray while the appeal runs its course. Jack stood up. Can we challenge Fitch? On what grounds a personal friendship from 60 years ago isn't automatic grounds for recusal? We'd need to show demonstrated bias, and that takes time we don't have. He could hear her moving papers on the other end. But here's what I need you to understand. Walter made that call from a sheriff's office holding cell while under arrest for violating a court order. That call is logged. The timing is logged. His attorney was not present. Jack went still. That's a problem for Walter. That is a significant problem for Walter, Gail said. Because if I can show that he made direct contact with an appellate judge from custody while his own appeal was pending before that judge's court, that is not a phone call between old friends. That is attempted judicial interference. And that, she said, is something the state bar does not overlook. Jack exhaled. How fast can you move on it? I'm calling Austin at 8 sharp, she said. You hold the line. He held it. He made coffee in Martha's kitchen and stood at the counter and held it while the house woke up around him, Martha's footsteps in the hallway. The sound of Emily's door, the particular creak of the porch when the morning wind pushed against it. He held it when Dale Whitmore knocked at 7:30 to report that Walter Carter had been released from the county holding cell at 5 a.m. on a personal recognizance bond, which was itself a conversation about how much reach a man still had even when the walls were closing in. He held it when Sandra Aldridge called to ask what was happening, and he told her honestly that they were one phone call away from either winning or having to fight for another month. Emily came to the kitchen doorway at 8. She looked at him, then at the phone on the wall, then back at him. Gail's calling Austin, she asked. He looked at her. How do you know about that? I heard you talking, she said. I wasn't asleep. She came in and sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands exactly the way she'd folded them beside the ice machine on the first afternoon. Is it going to work? I think so, Jack said. You thought so before, too. I still think so, he said. Thinking so doesn't stop. She looked at him with those steady eyes. Then she said, What happens to my daddy? Jack sat down across from her. It was the question he'd been expecting, and the one he'd had the least clean answer for. Your daddy has to decide what he wants to be, he said. That's not something I can decide for him, or you, or anybody else. Is he going to go to jail? I don't know, Jack said honestly. There may be charges. That depends on what the state bar recommends and what the county prosecutor decides. But that's separate from you. He held her gaze. Whatever happens to your dad legally, that doesn't change where you live. You understand that? She nodded. Then, he called Grandma yesterday, when I was sleeping. Jack waited. Grandma told me this morning, Emily said. He called and he said he was sorry. He cried on the phone. She looked at the table. Grandma said he sounded real. Do you believe that? Jack asked. She thought about it the way she always thought about hard things, slowly, without flinching from the parts that hurt. I believe he meant it when he said it, she said. I don't know yet if that's enough. That's an honest answer, Jack said. Is it okay to not know yet? That's the only honest place to start from, Jack said. At 9:47, Gail called back. Jack had the phone to his ear before the second ring. Tell me, he said. The State Bar's Ethics Board received my filing at 8:10 this morning, Gail said, and even through the phone line Jack could hear that her voice had changed again, something in it that wasn't quite triumph, but was in the same county. By 9:30, Judge Fitch had voluntarily recused himself from the appeal, effective immediately. The appeal has been reassigned to Judge Carol Meehan in San Antonio. A beat. Meehan has been on the bench for 12 years. She has never met Walter Carter. Jack closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Jack, Gail said. Yeah. Walter's attorney called me 20 minutes ago, she said. Harmon's withdrawing from the case. The room went quiet in Jack's head. Harmon's what? Withdrawing, effective today. I don't know if Walter can't pay him anymore, or if Harmon finally looked at the file and decided he didn't want his name on it, but either way. She paused. Walter Carter is currently without legal representation with an ethics board inquiry open against him, with an arrest on his record for court order violation, and with an appeal that is now in front of a judge who owes him absolutely nothing. Jack stood in Martha's kitchen and let that settle through him. What does he do now? He asked. Men like Walter have 2 moves when the walls close in, Gail said. They fight harder or they disappear. I think Walter Carter is going to disappear. Another beat. The full custody hearing is in 26 days. I don't think he's going to show up for it. And if he doesn't, then it becomes uncontested, Gail said, and Judge Meehan rules on the documentation alone. And the documentation is very, very good. Jack looked at Emily, who was watching his face the way she watched everything, reading it for information, for the real version of events rather than the managed one. He put the phone down. Well, Emily said. The judge who was going to help Walter took himself off the case, Jack said. New judge, no connection to the Carters. He watched her process it. Walter's lawyer quit. Emily was very still for a moment. Then she said, So, it's different now. It's different now, Jack said. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up at him and said, Is it okay if I go tell Grandma? Go ahead, he said. She got up from the table and went to the hallway, and he heard her call Martha's name, and then Martha's footsteps coming fast, and then the 2 of them talking in low, urgent voices that he didn't try to hear. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank the rest of his cold coffee, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for 6 days. The next 3 weeks moved the way things move when the pressure is gone, not slow exactly, but steadier. More deliberate, like a river after the flood crests, and the water starts to know where it's going. Walter Carter did not get another lawyer. He did not refile. He did not appear at Martha's house or call her phone or send anyone to Birchwood Road in the night. He became with remarkable speed the thing that powerful men sometimes become when their power is taken invisible. People around Red Hollow saw his truck less. The bank manager began making decisions without calling Walter first. The county commissioner, who had deferred to Walter for 11 years on every significant vote, submitted a formal request to the State Oversight Board to review the county's judicial appointment process. That last one made Dale Whitmore laugh out loud when he told Jack about it. 11 years, he said, and now suddenly he's concerned about oversight. Better late than never, Jack said. I guess, Dale said. Then, for what it's worth, I'm filing for the deputy sheriff position in Lubbock County. Opening came up. Better jurisdiction, better resources. He looked at Jack sideways. Better chance of actually doing the job the way it's supposed to be done. You should take it, Jack said. I'm going to, Dale said. I wanted you to know. Red Hollow needs good people, Jack said. Red Hollow needs different people, Dale said. And there was something in that not bitterness, just precision. I can't be both the guy who fought Walter Carter in this town and the guy who moves on from it. So I'm moving on. Jack understood that. He understood it in a way that had nothing to do with Dale Whitmore and everything to do with himself. On the 19th day, Ray Carter entered a voluntary inpatient treatment program in Lubbock. He called Martha before he left, and this time Emily was awake, and Martha asked if she wanted to talk to him, and Emily held the phone for a long moment before she said yes. Jack was on the porch. He didn't hear the conversation. He didn't try to. When Emily came back outside 20 minutes later, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She sat on the porch steps and picked at the loose railing piece she'd been working on since the first day. "How was that?" Jack asked. "Hard," she said. "Yeah." "He said he's going to try." She pulled at the railing piece. "He said he can't promise he'll make it, but he's going to try." "That's honest," Jack said. "I told him that was okay." She paused. "Is that the right thing to say?" "I think so," Jack said. "You gave him room without promising him anything. That's about right." She pulled the railing piece loose, looked at it, and set it on the step beside her. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Jack," he said, the way he'd been saying it every time she used the formal name, which was every time, because she hadn't quite gotten there yet. "Jack," she said. First time. Like she was trying the shape of it. "When is the hearing?" 7 days, he said. "And after the hearing, you stay here," he said. "With Martha. Permanent." She set both hands on the step on either side of her. "And you?" He didn't answer right away. She'd gotten good at reading his silences, which meant she probably already knew the answer, but she was asking anyway because she was an 8-year-old child, and this was the thing she needed to hear, said out loud. "I have to go back to New Mexico," he said. "I've been gone almost a month. I've got a ranch and people depending on me." He held her gaze. "That's the truth." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I knew." Another pause. "Are you going to forget about us?" "No," he said. "People say that." "I know they do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm going to come back, Emily. Not a visit, not passing through. I'm going to come back and check on you properly, and sit on this porch and eat whatever Martha's been baking and hear about school." He paused. "I'm going to keep coming back. That's what I'm telling you." She looked at him for a long time, not deciding whether to believe him, deciding he thought whether to let herself want to. "Okay," she said finally. The same word she'd said on the first night when he asked if he could take her to Martha's. Quiet and careful, and containing everything she hadn't said. The custody hearing on day 26 lasted 40 minutes. Walter Carter was not there. His absence was noted by Judge Meehan, who reviewed the documentation with the focused attention of someone who had read every page before she walked into the room. She asked Gail 3 questions. She asked Martha, too. She looked at the record of Emily's bruises at Dr. Ellison's corrected statement at Sandra Aldridge's 14 months of handwritten dates. Then she looked at Emily, who sat beside Martha in a clean dress, and her hair brushed, and said, "Miss Carter, do you want to live with your grandmother?" Emily said, "Yes, ma'am." Judge Meehan said, "Then that's where you'll live," and signed the order. It was the simplest thing. The most enormous simple thing Jack had ever witnessed. Martha pressed her lips together so hard they went white. She didn't cry in the courtroom. She waited until they were in the parking lot, and then she put her face in both hands for exactly 10 seconds, and then she straightened up and said, "Let's go home." Emily held Martha's hand all the way to the car and didn't let go. That night after supper, after Emily was in bed, Jack sat at Martha's kitchen table and wrote a letter. He hadn't written one in years. He hadn't known what to say. He still wasn't sure he knew, but he wrote it anyway, 4 pages long, the handwriting of a man who'd always been better at doing than saying, which is probably why it took him so long. He wrote to Claire. He told her he'd been in a small Texas town helping a little girl he'd met beside a gas station, and that the girl had asked him a question he hadn't known how to answer, whether his own daughter thought he'd stopped loving her. He told her he didn't know what the answer was to that question, and that was on him, not on her. He told her he hadn't been the kind of father she deserved, and that he'd been telling himself for 20 years that leaving clean was better than staying broken, and that an 8-year-old girl had shown him without meaning to exactly how wrong that was. He told her he understood if she didn't want to hear from him. He told her he was going to write anyway. He sealed it and addressed it to the last address he had for her, which was 6 years old, and gave it to Martha to mail with the quiet certainty of a man who knows a thing may not work, and does it anyway because not doing it is worse. Martha took it without comment and put it in her purse. "You're a good man, Jack Mercer," she said. "Took you long enough to act like it." He laughed, a real one, short and surprised. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It did. He left Red Hollow the next morning. Bobby drove. The other hands were asleep in the back before they hit the highway. The panhandle opened up in every direction, flat and enormous, and the color of old gold in the early light. Jack watched it go. He thought about Walter Carter, who had by all accounts retreated entirely to his ranch outside town and had not been seen at the bank or the courthouse or the golf course since the ethics inquiry opened. He thought about the state bar review, which Gale said would take another 3 months and would likely result in a formal censure and possibly worse. He thought about Dale Whitmore packing his apartment for Lubbock County. He thought about Sandra Aldridge, who had stopped keeping a notebook because she no longer had to, because the school had quietly and without announcement put in place a formal reporting protocol that the principal had signed off on without a single call to Walter Carter. He thought about Red Hollow changing. Not completely, not overnight. Towns didn't change that way. But the way a crack appears in old concrete, small, at first, then letting water in, then letting grass through, until eventually the concrete isn't what holds the shape anymore. He thought about Emily Carter, 8 years old, asleep in a bedroom on Birchwood Road with her horsebook on the nightstand and the door unlocked. He drove back to New Mexico and went back to work. 3 weeks later, a letter came to the ranch from a return address in Denver, Colorado. It was 5 lines. Claire's handwriting, he recognized it from birthday cards she'd stopped sending 8 years ago, smaller now, more controlled, but the same. The 5 lines said, "I got your letter. I don't know what I want to say yet, but I'm glad you wrote. I'll write again when I know what I want to say. C." Jack read it 3 times, standing at the mailbox. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket next to where he kept the photograph of her at 10 years old and walked back to the barn. Winter came early to the Panhandle that year. By November, the temperature dropped hard and fast the way it did in West Texas. No warning, just the wind off the plains cutting clean and cold. Jack had been back in New Mexico for 4 months, and he'd called Martha twice a month every month. And each time Martha told him how Emily was doing in school, well, which surprised no one, and what she'd been reading, and how the horsebook had led to a serious interest in actual horses, which Martha was considering carefully. On the second Friday of November, Jack loaded a bag into his truck and told Bobby he'd be gone for the weekend. Bobby looked at the bag, then at Jack. "Red Hollow." "Red Hollow," Jack said. "Give her our best," Bobby said. He drove the 1,100 miles in 2 days. He'd driven it before, and he'd drive it again. He was getting better at knowing that the road wasn't an escape, just a distance between 2 places that mattered. He turned onto Birchwood Road in the early afternoon, and the cottonwood in the neighbor's yard had gone bare, and the air had that particular cold in it that said winter was already decided, no argument. He parked in front of Martha's house and sat for a moment with the engine ticking. The front door opened before he got to the porch. Emily stood in the doorway. She'd grown not much but enough to notice. Her hair was longer. She was wearing a blue sweater that was slightly too big for her, probably Martha's, and she was holding something in both hands. Jack got to the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. She held out what she was carrying. A pie, still warm from the way she was holding it, careful and level. Peach by the smell of it, Martha's recipe, the same one Emily had eaten that very first afternoon at the kitchen table with the desperate attention of a child who hadn't had enough. "Grandma said you were coming," Emily said. "I helped make it." Jack looked at the pie. Then at this girl, not the child beside the ice machine. Though she was still that too, would carry that with her for a long time. The way people carry the hard things. But she was something else now as well. Something new and tentative, and beginning like green wood after a fire. 8 years old with peach pie and creek water eyes standing in a doorway that opened from the inside. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would," he said. She looked at him for a moment. That old steadiness, that careful reading of the world. And then something in her face opened up. Not wide, not all at once. Just enough. Just the first real version of it, the kind that hadn't been practiced into shape. She smiled. Jack Mercer climbed the porch steps and took the pie from her so she wouldn't drop it, and he put his free hand briefly on her shoulder, the lightest touch, the kind that says, "I see you. I'm here. You're all right," in the language that doesn't need words. And they went inside. That is the truth about what happened in Red Hollow, Texas in the summer and fall of a year, when a retired rodeo cowboy took a wrong turn off the Panhandle Highway and found beside a gas station ice machine the reason he'd been put on this earth. Not glory. Not a fight he could win with his hands. Just a girl who had stopped expecting anyone to come, and a man who finally understood that staying is the bravest thing a person can do, braver than riding, braver than fighting, braver than any 8-second bell. He stayed. And because he stayed, she learned to believe that the world contained people who meant what they said. That is the thing that cannot be taken away. Not by a courthouse, not by a family name, not by 40 years of practiced power or a single phone call from a holding cell. Once a child learns that someone will come back, truly learns it in the body, in the bones that knowledge becomes the foundation. Everything else is built on. Jack Mercer came back, and Emily Carter built her life on that.